Got the thumbs up. Well, good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Hello, hello. I am Professor Philip Napoli. I am the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And welcome to day 2 of the 6th annual Humanities and Social Science Student Expo. It is a celebration of the academic achievements of the students in our school. Today is going to be a really exciting day with lots and lots of activity all around campus, including here in the library with consecutive presentations here in this room and up in 411, and then out in the yard, starting at, I think, 12:30 with what is it called? Performing the Middle Ages, led by my colleague, Professor Lauren Mancia, and many others in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. This morning, we are privileged and excited to be listening to the honors I'm going to try and get it right. The Honors Colloquium Senior Thesis presentations. Did I get that right? Led by Professor Casey Johnson, my colleague. And I'm going to let Professor Johnson do a couple of introductions and then turn the floor over to the students.
So our class joined the colloquium last year, and it just went so well that I decided to ask 4 of our students from differing disciplines, but in varying ways, I think, reflecting the spirit of HSS to sort of present. So we're going to start off with Sydney, who's going to be discussing contemporary events in the Western Balkans. Then move on to Julio, Sydney is sort of history / political science. Julio is in English, talking about the contrast between high and low literature. Then we'll move on to Antar, who was outside of the school in his discipline. He's from business, but he's working on the psychology of bubbles, and it very much fits in, I think, with the spirit of our approach. And then we'll finish with Diana, who has a really interesting thesis on sort of a combination of public policy and political science on mobile street vendors. So let's start with Sydney. And each of the students are going to present, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end.
Hi, my name is Sydney. My thesis is on the Russo-Ukrainian War and implications for the Western Balkans. My advisor for this project was Dr. Bridget O'Keefe, and she's a history professor. So this research aims to explore how Russia's ongoing actions in Ukraine could shape the Balkans' future, including challenges like rising nationalism and the potential for greater integration into Western institutions, ultimately with the hope of contributing to a better understanding of European security dynamics. So my questions of focus for this project were broken down into 3 main topics of focus: the what makes this region so important to Russia, the how does Russia assert influence over the Western Balkan region, and the why. Why does continued influence in this region matter in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine? These questions seek to explore the strategic interests driving Russia's actions in the Balkans, the methods it uses to maintain influences, and the broader consequences of this influence in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. By addressing these aspects, I aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of Russia's role in the region and the potential long-term impacts on both Balkans and European stability. So before I begin, it's important to define the Western Balkans as it relates to this topic. Typically, the Western Balkans consists of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, as well as Albania. But for the sake of relevance to the topics that I'm going to speak about, as well as relation to one another, I have chosen to only focus on the Serbo-Croatian-speaking countries of the Balkans, which are Bosnia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And I will also be focusing on Kosovo as well, as it's very significant to the discussion of Serbia, because until 2008, when it declared its independence, Kosovo was considered a province of Serbia. And to this day, there are a number of countries who recognize it as Serbian territory, such as Russia and Serbia. So the first question is the what. What makes this region so important to Russia? The Western Balkans are the last unaligned region in Europe, making them a crucial area for Russia to maintain its influence and counter NATO and EU expansion. The region serves as a strategic buffer zone against further Western influence into Eastern Europe. Russia leverages deep cultural and religious ties, particularly through organizations like the Serbian Orthodox Church, to strengthen its influence and position itself as a protector of Eastern Orthodoxy, as well as aligning itself with national identities like in countries like Serbia or those with notable Serbian populations, such as Bosnia's Republic of Srpska. By supporting separatist movements and promoting anti-Western narratives, Russia helps prevent further Western integration, portraying itself as a defender against NATO intervention and preserving a geopolitical foothold in the Balkans amidst growing Western influence. So next, now that we kind of understand the significance, how does Russia assert influence over the Western Balkan region? I focused on 4 main channels for this research: politics, religion, media, and military. Politically, Russia exerts influences through strategic alliances, economic leverage, and through direct interference. Moscow has historically backed pro-Russian leaders and parties, offering both diplomatic and financial support. It has also been linked to election interference and destabilizing efforts, such as a 2016 attempted coup in Montenegro, which sought to overthrow the pro-NATO president at the time. These actions aim to maintain Russia's presence in the Balkans, counter NATO and EU expansion, and assert itself in Europe. Secondly, religion. With Russia, recently, they've been leveraging both Orthodox Christianity and recently adopting Islam as well. The Serbian Orthodox Church plays a key role in this, linking faith with Serbian nationalism. Its connection to the Russian Orthodox Church allows Russia to present itself as a defender of Eastern Orthodoxy. Projects like Putin's church in Banstol, Serbia, strengthen these ties and reinforce Russia's geopolitical influence. Russia also has more recently started to align with the Muslim-majority countries in the Balkans, like Kosovo and Bosnia, through Kremlin-funded, Kremlin-led platforms such as the European Muslim Forum. So the next channel of influence is media. Media is a very powerful tool for Russia in the Western Balkans, as it especially targets the Serbo-Croatian-speaking populations. Kremlin-backed media outlets like Sputnik shape public opinion, support pro-Russian movements, and undermine NATO and EU integration, ultimately aligning with Russia's strategic interests in the region. From a military perspective, this is mostly with Serbia, as Russia has a bilateral agreement that includes providing each other with equipment and also conducting joint exercises with one another. Russia has also been noted to fund nationalist and paramilitary groups in the Balkan region, and including promoting Serbian military camps for Serbian youth. Russia also opposes NATO expansion, supporting Serbia's stance on Kosovo, and deepening this regional divide with NATO and Russia. This support, combined with election interference, helps Russia maintain influence as NATO's presence grows, especially in light of everything with NATO in Eastern Europe right now and Ukraine. So to kind of illustrate these points a little bit more, I have some pictures. This is a gas ad from a Russian company. It says Zajedno, which means together. Obviously, the Russian flag on one side, the Serbian flag. This just goes to promote the Russian and Serbian ideal, or Russian and Serbian brotherhood, even in advertising for gas. Next, this is a billboard that says "Thank you, Russian brothers." It's from 2020 in Bosnia's Republic of Srpska, and it was used to commemorate Russian aid given to Bosnia's Republic of Srpska during the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, just acts as a testament between the Russian and Serbian brotherhood, as this aid was only given in Bosnia's Serbian Republic of Srpska and not in Bosnia's Bosniak Croat Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This third image is from a monastery in Bosnia's Republic of Srpska. As you can see, Putin is there. And it just goes to show it's a testament to the relationship between the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, more specifically the reverence that the Serbian Orthodox Church holds for the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia. This is an anti-NATO ad in Bosnia. It just says, "I will not join NATO." And it's just a reminder of it uses the Yugoslavia bombings of 1999 as a reminder of past NATO aggressions towards Serbia and Serbs, fueling further divide and kind of aligning with the anti-NATO sentiment that Russia pushes. This last one is a Trump and Putin ad in Montenegro, calling for the world to be great, but on like Russia-Putin terms. This is from 2016, but it's kind of more relevant than ever now with the developments with Trump and Russia and his admiration for Putin. The top is in Russian, the bottom is in English. It says the same thing, but this was actually funded by a Montenegrin news agency rather than Russia or anything. So now the why. Why does this continued influence in the region matter in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine? Russia expected a very quick victory in Ukraine, underestimating the strength of Ukrainian resilience and as well as the strength of international opposition. But these miscalculations have weakened Russia's global influence, shifting the geopolitical landscape and impacting the Balkans. For instance, there was a 2021 succession plan for Bosnia's Republic of Srpska that was indirectly reliant on Russian support, but it was halted as Russia retreated from Kyiv and international troops strengthened their presence in Bosnia. This event is an example of how local Balkan movements are closely linked with broader international dynamics and especially influenced by Russia. The Balkans remain a politically fragmented region that are vulnerable to external influence, and although Russia's failures temporarily disrupted destabilizing efforts, the region's fragile stability is still at risk. Russian support for nationalist movements and pro-Russian fractions in the country fuel ethnic tension and political tension, hindering cohesion and delaying regional progress. Countries like Montenegro, which have now joined NATO, face the challenge of balancing Western commitments with growing pressure from Russia. Ultimately, the war in Ukraine has reshaped Europe's power dynamics, amplifying the challenges faced by the Western Balkans as it navigates its path towards stability, whether that be through alignment with Western institutions such as the EU or NATO, or whether that be on its own unaligned path. So to conclude, for lasting change in the Balkans, it's crucial that those in power recognize the urgency of the situation and take meaningful steps to address the region's challenges. Internal stability is essential, but it will remain difficult as long as destabilizing external influences exist, particularly like countries like Russia. Focusing on democratic reforms such as media freedom, political transparency, and regional cooperation is key to the Balkans' future. And while external powers can assist in these processes, it's vital to distinguish between those that promote stability and those, like Russia, that seek to destabilize the region. And this sentiment just doesn't come out of nowhere. Russia's history in Eastern Europe shows its tendency to divide rather than to create cooperation, as we've seen in countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova, Romania, where Russia has exploited internal divisions for its own geopolitical gain, disregarding the people and the stability of the countries. The war in Ukraine has only intensified these tactics, using political and ethnic fragmentation to weaken the Eastern European region's potential for unity and integration into the West. Addressing these external threats is critical for regional leaders and international allies alike to ensure lasting stability and prosperity. The Western Balkans must prioritize internal cohesion and foster external partnerships and resist divisive forces for a more stable and more secure future.
Hi, my name is Julio Vasquez Jimenez. I am a senior at the college, and I will be presenting on the topic, how does the distinction between high and low literature reflect the way that society functions? And I was helped by my advisor, Professor Heidi Deal. Now, in order to understand this, we have to look at what is high and what is low. So, high literature or low high or highbrow literature is considered to be or defined by the OED as rarefied or intellectually demanding. So this means that after you read a certain book, you're left thinking about it profoundly. It makes you think of something different. It has something that it contains a high level of prowess in the wording and such like that. What does it look like? Well, it tends to be exclusive and prestigious. You'll find these books in colleges or universities, and it's in the sphere of academics or scholars, which means that you'll only find professors or editors or writers really being able to interact or have something to say about these books. And it's also considered as like the blueprint in schools. So if you are in a literature class, or even when you're in growing up in like first to K through 8th or K through 12, you kind of model the way that writers wrote to be able to write in your classes. Now, low literature is kind of defined as the opposite. So instead of being rarefied, it's popular and is not seen as highly intellectual. So you can think of it as like the fast food of literature. And it also looks different. So it's inclusive, it's popular, and it's also not discussed in academic settings. So if I were to ask you really quickly, what's what's one book that you would think is high literature? What would you guess? Or an author? Yeah. Well, yeah. The first one that came to mind for me was Shakespeare, but Stephen King would also be considered that. But well, actually, we'll go back to that. There's Mary Shelley. There's also Daniel Defoe and Radcliffe, and I guess there's many more like Toni Morrison. But for low literature, it would be the opposite. So you would have books like Twilight or The Hunger Games, which are not bad books. They're actually the opposite. They're successful, but they're popular. And you probably haven't had a professor or had in your classes discuss these books. It's very low probability. Now, what I want to lead you guys to is that literature has a hierarchy. And because there's this hierarchy, it kind of affects the way that there's a certain way that it is categorized. And so it affects how we read it and what books we choose to read. So you probably can't see this video, but this is Judi Dench, who's an actress, and she's known for being on a lot of plays about Shakespeare and her association with Shakespeare. And because she's associated with Shakespeare, which I established to be like an example of high literature, whenever people are around her, she kind of is taken more seriously because of the fact that, like in this video, she's able to recite a sonnet from the top of her head, which do not ask me to do that because I can't do that, the same thing. But this also suggests that, like in our society, there is mobility, or at least we're led to be, that there's upward mobility. And this is reflected in the way that lower works or books that are considered to be low literature can eventually mobilize or rise to high status, like Daniel Defoe, who used to be considered low literature in his time. And one thing that's important is that once you enter into this high status or high level of recognition, you're there permanently. So this even applies to books that are considered outdated or offensive. So the example that I have here is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, that I believe uses the N-word or a slur, but this also applies to other books that may use a slur for the LGBTQ community. So this leads me to Samuel Johnson, because I'm not someone, and I don't think most of us would really have a say to decide what is high or low literature. But someone like Samuel Johnson, who was a writer and literary critic, he's actually credited for his commentary on Shakespeare, which is why a lot of people take him seriously, Shakespeare, which is kind of crazy to say. And he also created his own dictionary, which gave him even more power or more influence to shape the way that we use words and what is considered like the standard, because that's what high literature also is. It's a standard. It's a way that, like, if you fit it, then you're good, but if you don't, then you're outside of that sphere. So my main point is that this system is inherently flawed. The high and low literature is classified based on the basis of perception. So it implies that there's a bias and that it favors certain works without merit. And victims of this tend to be writers from marginalized backgrounds. So I focus on race and gender. But I want you to think about, how do we imagine the default writer to look like? So if you had a class to read a book, what would be like the default person? How would they look like? Does anyone have an idea? No? Okay. Well, usually these writers tend to be men. They're white. They're English, both in from England, and they speak English. They usually, if they are not that, they're seen as the other. So I kind of expand in that in this example. So to the left, this is a real person. Her name is Phyllis Wheatley, and she's taught in the curriculum in many schools, or at least in colleges, that she was an enslaved woman, but she was literate, and she was able to be the first of her kind to publish poetry or publish a book. And when she's discussed at least in my experience in schools, her work is discussed about or talked about, but it's not prioritized. Like, she's not prioritized for her skill, but prioritized for being different, which is fine, but it creates this sense of otherizing that maybe you just see this person based off of what makes them different, because they're not the default writer. So this also applies to, on the right, Frances Burney, who, that's not a picture of her, but this is a story of Evelina, which is also in the curriculum. And when she's discussed or talked about, it's always in relation to gender, which is fine as well, but it kind of overshadows sometimes her skill as a writer. Because again, if I told you, okay, if you were to talk about William Shakespeare, you're not going to ask, how does his gender as a man, how did this influence that? Or how did him being white influence that? But we ask these questions about other writers. Research shows, according to the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, that there is a great benefits to having diversity and representation and exposure, but there's a greater negative impact when there isn't representation, and it affects a lot of students of color. So I conclude that since literature and society are connected, and literature is a product of society, that perhaps issues that we have in literature can be a model for solutions, or going into for finding a right, for bringing us to the path of a better solution for societal problems. So I propose that exposure to different writers, to different stories, different usage of literary techniques and strategies can kind of get us out of that spirit of otherizing and make us see them as the default. And we could also apply this to society, because if we practice having diversity of thought, diversity of different experiences, and actually taking the time to discern between fact and opinion, we could have more conversations that could lead us to better solutions. So thank you, and that's my part. That's my presentation.
Hey y'all, morning. I'm Antar, and I'm a senior. I'm majoring in finance. I'm graduating this May, and I worked with Professor Ninen to finish my thesis. And so for my final thesis, I wanted to understand how excessive optimism and overconfidence led many institutional investors, such as endowment funds, pension funds, hedge funds, to invest heavily in the housing market pre-2008. A lot of you probably don't remember. In 2008, we had a housing crisis. A lot of bad things happened. So before I start my presentation, I want to do a quick survey and ask you, how many of you here think that house prices only go up? You can raise your hand and just tell me. And okay, so we have probably like 50%, maybe a little bit higher than 50% think that house prices only go up. Okay, that's good. So to understand this paper, you have to understand what a bubble is. A bubble in financial context is when there's a temporary surge in asset prices, whether it be your stock, your real estate, gold, silver, whatever it may be. It's typically driven by speculative mania or enthusiasm, and that obviously eventually leads to a sharp collapse in the asset price. So two of the main bubbles that I looked at was one, RCA, which stands for Radio Company of America. There was a bubble in 1920s simply because of all the radio technology and all the enthusiasm around the radio technology. And a lot of people thought that radio technology was going to change the way we would live. Obviously it did, but a lot of people started bidding up the price of RCA. And the stock went up 13-fold, and then eventually it dropped basically by 98%, and basically all of its value was wiped out. The second one that I looked at was the South Sea bubble of the 1700s. South Sea bubble. South Sea was a company. It was formed in Great Britain. It was formed to assume the debt of the British government by issuing stocks. So a lot of people got excited because South Sea bubble, in exchange of assuming that, they got the right to trade with Spanish colonies. In particular, they got the right to sell slaves in Spanish colonies. So a lot of people got excited. Obviously, slaves back then, they were, that practice was legalized. And so a lot of people were excited, including Sir Isaac Newton. He jumped in. He made a lot of money, initially. But, later on, he realized that the market was overheating a little bit, so he got out. But he was seeing other people around him who were getting rich, so he couldn't really resist. So he jumped back in and eventually lost all the money that he'd made previously. After losing all the money, he basically said, I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but I cannot calculate the mania of the people, because it was that much crazy back then. So how does how does a bubble form? Like what's the mechanism behind a bubble? You'll have a rising asset price. So think about like Bitcoin nowadays going up to 15-fold or something like that. What that does is that it brings in a lot of media attention. Your social networks start talking about it. You get excited, right? So that increased attention leads to increased demand for that asset, right? There's this flat demand, not flat demand. There's this flat supply of the asset, right? So all the gold we have in the world, right? The supply is not going to go up. Well, the supply is not going to go up, but the demand goes up. So that leads to increased asset prices, and the bubble just continues, and eventually it leads to a bursting of the bubble. So the key takeaway is that even rational people like Sir Isaac Newton can fool themselves into thinking that they can predict when the bubble is going to pop so they can get out in time, but obviously that never happens. Some of the literature looked at, so between 1913 and 1990s, home prices basically were flat except for two periods. We had the World War ending in 1940s. So a lot of soldiers are returning from overseas. They were getting married, having kids, so that led to an increase in demand for houses. And obviously that was fundamentally driven because there was a short supply in houses. There was a lot of the war effort going into World War II. So there was an underbuilt in houses in America. So that was justified. But in 1997, leading up to 2005, the house prices went up about 71%. And obviously there was no fundamental reason for it to go up that much because nothing really exciting happening in that area of the economy. If you look at price to rent ratio or real interest rate around that time, they were basically disconnected from the fundamentals. When your rents go down over time and your interest rates don't go down, instead they go up, home prices, from a fundamental DCF perspective, shouldn't go up. But that's what basically happened from 1997 to 2005. There was another survey that was done where Professor Schiller looked at, or asked rather, some of the institutional investors, why did you buy this thing or that thing? They couldn't explain. A lot of times they would just say or attribute their reasoning to their gut feeling. And that's really what happens a lot of times in financial markets. It's driven by how you feel, your emotion, and so forth. It's not always driven by your data. So what was like the investment behavior leading up to the 08-07 pre-crash? There was a fundamental shift in mindset. People started thinking that homes were really speculative assets, much like in today's world, Bitcoin, or like any other meme coin we have, like a Trump coin or something like that. They were not really places to live, but rather something that you can flip to make a buck or two. There was another survey done by Kish and Professor Case and Schiller where they asked a lot of home buyers, like, what do you expect home prices to go up over the next couple of decades or something like that? And they were saying, the majority of them said home prices should go up 9 to 15% per annum. And obviously that's detached from reality if you look at past history when home prices were basically flat in real terms. So that tells you there was a lot of enthusiasm, much like, in today's world, a lot of people are excited about gold going up to 5,000, right? So, things like that always happen because we're emotional being. And also there's an investor logic that, if everyone else is buying it, then I should also jump in because they've probably done their homework. If others are doing it, it's probably the right investment. The two culprits of the 08-07 crisis from an instrument perspective, meaning people, the stuff that they were buying, were MBS and CDOs. MBS stands for mortgage-backed securities, and CDO stands for collateral debt obligation. I don't want to bore you with like the jargon, but like MBS, like think of taking or like buying a lot of different mortgages and then pooling them together and then putting them into different risk buckets and then selling them to investors. So that was a practice that was being done. Obviously, if you didn't have that practice, mortgage market or people being able to buy homes wouldn't really exist. It really makes a liquid market for people to buy, get a loan from the bank and then buy their home. So the problem though was that there were these mortgage lenders and banks that started, giving out loans to toxic, risky borrowers, and they're called the subprime. So think about credit score being anywhere from 550 to 600. That's really bad. Okay, that's really bad. And so that percentage of the total mortgage origination pool went from 8% to all the way to like 21, 22%. Okay, so that's really bad. And so when you have that kind of problem, and people always, well, they have been thinking going after that point that house prices never go up. I mean, they always go up, and that they should never go down, right? The music is not going to stop anytime soon, right? That was kind of like the belief. It leads to all kinds of problems, because when home prices start going down for whatever reason, because you have these, toxic borrowers and they can pay back their loans, then they're sitting in negative equity, and that's really bad. And you also have all kinds of problems related to, originators just getting their fees by originating these loans and selling them to Wall Street, not caring about, the people that they're lending their money to. There was a disconnect between the key stakeholders. In terms of like the institutional failure, so once cracks started forming in these two markets, the MBS and the CDO markets, farms or banks, back then banks were allowed to invest in MBS and CDOs and so forth. The banks that were highly leveraged, think about running your business 30 times leveraged. So if you have $1 of equity in the business, you're borrowing 30 times that. So like you have $30 of borrowed money and a $1 of equity. So banks that were running, highly levered businesses, there were little room for error, right? So when those MBS started defaulting, right, a lot of banks went bust. So Bear Stearns, which was later bought by JPM or JP Morgan Chase, went bust simply because they were running a very highly levered business. And there were also neglected risk where institutions ignored a lot of low probability event, or the so-called black swan event. I'm sure you've heard that phrase quite a lot. And then there was also a lot of optimism, false confidence that were being a lot of people just believed in, like Lehman Brothers, which went bust in 2008, meaning it defaulted on their debt in September 2008. They dismissed the notion that there wouldn't be any decrease in home prices nationally, because home prices always go up, and they did believe that home prices would probably go down regionally, but of course home prices started going down across the board. And there are also regulatory blind spot. For instance, like one of the things that really stand out from there is that pre-1970, if you wanted to issue MBS or something like any kind of instruments, you'd get the rating. Well, the investors would pay for the rating from the credit rating agencies. Think about S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. Those are the credit agencies. But after 1970s, regulations changed. So what that meant was that the very people that were trying to issue this MBS would pay these rating agencies to rate their MBS. So you can kind of see like the conflict of interest. Because obviously the rating agencies would definitely want to give high ratings. So there was a lot of high inflation, like rating inflation, not inflation in price sense, but like rating inflation. It's like you're getting, A's in all of your classes despite doing like very, very minimum work, that kind of thing. So there are like red flags across the board. People are very comfortable in what they're doing. They believed in the idea that music wouldn't stop, so it just kept on going. But obviously, it all stopped around when Lehman went bust. So the key lessons from this thesis that I did is that psychology matters more than math. Emotional biases like optimism and overconfidence can override data. And a lot of people, there was a widespread denial in 2008 that everyone from home buyers to regulators, bankers, and so forth, they believed that good times would last forever. Of course, they didn't. And there was also modeling limitations. You can obviously model out what GDP of America is going to grow in 2027, 2028, but you can't really forecast or model how people are going to react to certain things. Like no one probably predicted how COVID would cause a decrease in supply, or not decrease supply, how people would react to toilet paper shortage or something like that. You can't predict that, can you? You can't predict that on an Excel model. And so to prevent future crises, I believe that we need better integration of behavioral finance into risk management and policy, so that we don't have another big crisis like the 2008, 2007 ever happen again. Even if they happen, maybe we can mitigate them and keep them to a shorter extent. Yeah, thank you.
Can everyone see that? Okay. So hello everyone. everyone. Good morning. My name is Diana Reyes. I'm a fourth-year political science student, double minoring in sociology and Spanish translations. I'll be talking about street vending, specifically how do street vending policies shape and affect the lives and subjectivities of New York City street vendors from immigrant backgrounds. And my advisor was Professor Sue from the political science department. Just to give a couple of background and context, the Department of Sanitation categorizes street vending into three categories: general vendors, mobile food vendors, and First Amendment vendors. And to narrow the scope of my research, I primarily focused on mobile food vendors and not street vendors altogether, given that street vendors, general vendors, are the ones who sell either sunglasses, hats, totes, shirts, and stuff like that, but I'm focusing on food vendors. And the subtopics that I'll be specifically addressing are daily life, policing, and advocacy. And just to talk about the relevancy of this issue, just recently in the 2024 New York City elections, New York City voters voted on ballot proposal 2, and it was passed. It was titled Cleaning Public Property, which planned on increasing the Department of Sanitation's authority to keep city property clean, and it explicitly states that it includes holding street vendors accountable for following the stipulations. Again, given the long history of street vending and the unfolding policy that we have currently today, you can see that it is a pressing and relevant issue. Just to talk a little bit more about the conversations and common trends concerning street vending, this is an article that a journal that I specifically wanted to highlight, titled Street Vending in a Neoliberal City, A Global Perspective on the Practices and Policies of a Marginalized Economy. They take on a global approach where they mainly highlight the vending activities and urban policies in cities like Berlin, New York City, Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, Calcutta, and Mexico City. I primarily focus on the section where they talk about New York City, right? They talk about and define street vending as a person who offers goods for sale to the public without having a permanent built-up structure with a temporary static structure or mobile stall. And they also talk about how it's an informalized practice, right? Oftentimes when it comes to talking about street vending, it's seen as informal and it's not formalized. And they mentioned how it encompasses the nature of street vending as a process between avoiding and complying with governmental interference. That's an important part that I will later on highlight. Again, moving on to the public spaces and how usage and appearance are maintained by policymakers through public-private partnerships, and mechanisms of surveillance and policing. So that's another subtopic that I will be talking about: policing and surveilling in terms of street vending and how it's regulated in the city. Given the government's and state involvement in informal sectors by regulating outdoor vending or simply banning it, vendors are forced to work around and bend formal rules and laws, which leads me on to my next topic of conversation, which are the crackdown operations that have been conducted throughout the summers, but they're also conducted throughout the year. They have been conducted in Queens, specifically in Corona, Jackson Heights, Flushing, which have the highest concentrations of vendors. And specifically, it's important to highlight these because they're vendors of Hispanic and immigrant backgrounds, right? The highly restrictive policies make it almost impossible for vendors to obtain a permit. There's a difference between obtaining a permit and a license. A license is more accessible for vendors, and many vendors do have a license. However, the process to obtain a permit is much harder, as there are also caps. The caps currently, which I later on explain, is at around 5,100. Initially in the 1980s, it was 3,000 if I'm not mistaken. I later highlight that on in my presentation. Thus, in their attempt to obtain a permit, some unlicensed vendors find themselves paying up to $150 to a day to military veterans who are eligible to apply for a lifetime vendor's license. So again, this makes them or forces them to look through different avenues to obtain a permit, unfortunately. I also want to highlight the gender disparities amongst the community, right? The Immigration Research Initiative found that women are less likely to have licenses or permits. In fact, women make up half of the food vendors, but are more likely to lack a permit, unfortunately. Just to go over briefly the history of street vending policies in an urban city, I wanted to highlight the local law of 1941, which essentially attempted to restrict peddling or selling goods on the street. However, there was a case that was brought to court, and in a ruling of 1941 in Goodhumor versus the City of New York, they found that the local law was invalid, as the court determined that the city did not have the constitutional power to protect storekeepers from competition of street vendors. Good Humor Corp essentially was the plaintiff, and they were an ice cream selling business who were obviously selling, and they were vendors. However, they brought the case to court, and the court determined that it was unconstitutional for the city to do that. Correct? That's something that I wanted to highlight because you can obviously see the efforts in trying to tackle street vendors and tackle and bring it down, right? There's also debates on the role of public spaces. Again, I previously mentioned how there's policies, and the way that they're designed are made to police and to surveil street vendors in the spaces, and it obviously determines where they can sell, which is something that I also wanted to highlight after. The limit imposed on the number of licenses and permits available to vendors to apply, again, how I mentioned in the 1980s, essentially it was capped at 3,000, and currently, as of 2024, it's currently at 5,100. I also wanted to talk about the intersection where you could see the intersection between immigration and street vending policy, right? An introductory bill 621 of 2004, it was introduced by city council members Philip Reed and John Liu and Miguel Martinez. It essentially proposed opening all streets to vending except for the streets surrounding the World Trade Center site, and it also proposed a fingerprint requirement for applicants. And this is something that I really want to highlight. That fingerprint requirement was going to pose significant obstacles for immigrant folks, specifically undocumented individuals who were in an attempt to, or who were aspiring to apply for a permit. That specifically would, obviously obtaining fingerprinting and obtaining all of those documentation would limit their access to obtaining a permit. And again, street vending is one of their main forms of income. And I also want to talk about Introductory Bill 491A of 2005, which stipulates that no city employee ask about the immigration or citizenship status of any person applying for a general food vending license. That specifically I wanted to highlight again because you can see the contrast in which activists, and vendors who were advocating for the immigrant and undocumented community to have access to applying to these permits. There you see the contrast between 2004 and 2005. I also wanted to highlight local law of 2008. It was proposed by the New York City Council and Mayor Bloomberg, and it was passed into legislation. It established 1,000 permits for a new street class of vendors called the Green Cart. It was like an initiative essentially to promote to promote having like fruits and access to fruits and other fresh goods in neighborhoods that don't have that access. So that's something I also wanted to highlight. I also want to talk about the police crackdowns in terms of like the subtopics of advocacy and policing, right? Police crackdowns and the criminalization of street vending. I want to highlight the Street Vending Advisory Board and the establishment of that, and the establishment of the Office of Street Vendor Enforcement, which was established to represent street vendors in the legislative process and proposed bills that directly affect street vendors, because they're oftentimes not directly represented in the process of like the policy making and stuff like that, right? The advisory board compromises representatives from the New York Immigration Coalition, which is very big on advocacy for the community, the Street Vendor Project, the Real Estate Board of New York, Sunset Park Business Improvement District, and the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. Since then, only a handful of licenses have been issued. However, this was a victory for vendors in general and advocates as they established the advisory board, which is currently. I also want to highlight the transition in which how like different departments have who are overseeing street vending and street vending policies, right, and regulating it. Most importantly, it went from the NYPD to the New York City Department of Consumer Protection, and now it is under the Department of Sanitation. We have yet to see how these were recent changes. We have yet to see how that's going to affect. Obviously, under the NYPD, there was various crackdowns, various harassment by the police and stuff like that. And we'll see how it goes under the Department of Sanitation now. I want to highlight specifically, there have been various videos online where there's street vendors that are either harassed by the police, getting their goods taken away. Maria Falcon is one of the many street vendors who has been victims of this, of the policing, of the surveilling of the NYPD. She was stationed at the Broadway Junction train station and was arrested after receiving 2 summonses and being warned by the police for not having a valid permit. Here you can see this is obtained from an article where she talks about her experience being arrested and being taken into custody and stuff like that. Here you can see more recently in 2024, the video is not going to play, but Here you can see a more recent video of last year of Blanca Alvarado. Like Blanca and Maria Falcon, the street vending is one of their main forms of income, and they are the either head of households, either single mothers, but street vending provides them the flexibility to either be present in other areas of their lives, whether it is picking up their children or allowing them to, again, being flexible and having that flexible schedule, and it is a form of income for many families. However, despite this, despite the fact that street vending has generated a lot to the local economy, they are still being harassed and policed and surveilled. And moving on to my next subtopic of advocacy, the social mobilization of street vendors, I want to talk about and highlight the Street Vendor Project, which was established in 2001. The Street Vendor Project has various campaigns, from the Lift the Caps and the Pushcart Fund to the Fund Excluded Workers Coalition to the Street Vendor Justice Coalition. However, I do want to highlight their small business empowerment program. I previously mentioned how street vending is viewed as an informalized practice, and oftentimes street vendors are not seen as small business owners. However, the Street Vendor Project aims to mobilize and to uplift the community to, by providing holistic support and, allow them to pursue their business endeavors. And lastly, the gentrification and its effect on street vending. I wanted to highlight this specifically because I previously mentioned how policy affects where the street vendor sells, where they are permitted to sell, where they're located, where they're established, however, and that also affects policing and all of the stuff that's going around. In some neighborhoods, the businesses reflect the population and vice versa. And I quote, Black vendors vending in Black neighborhoods, Latino vendors in Latino neighborhoods. And when vendors in brick and mortar businesses serve the same customers, there's competitive pressures between the two, right? And it causes increased foot traffic and, a lot of conversations between who is allowed to sell, where they're allowed to sell, and, who's there. However, there has been resistance and talking about advocacy in general. Advocacy group Mexicanos Unidos organized an event called Plaza Tonatu in honor of the Aztec god in a part of Sunset. And as you know, Sunset is historically has been a majority Hispanic, a neighborhood where there's a lot of vendors and stuff like that. And the event aimed to be a statement, essentially. In reference to just gentrification, it aimed to combat, you mentioned, to combat it, you have to be able to localize your economy. So essentially what the vendors did was, as a form of resistance, they didn't acquire a permit to hold the event, and they gathered a bunch of vendors to come to the fair and speak and do, sell their goods and stuff like that. Again, there's various forms of resistance, there's various forms of advocacy, and from the Street Vendor Project to groups advocacy groups like Mexicanos Unidos, but there's also other groups like Make the Road who also mobilize and uplift the community. There's also groups like NYIC who also help the community and stuff like that. And in conclusion, it's important to talk about, as I previously mentioned, the relevancy of the issue, the implications of Proposition 2, which was the clean the city, and the enforcement could potentially conclude through mass crackdown operations in neighborhoods where there's a high concentration of vendors, whether it is in Corona, Queens, and Sunset Park, whether it is in Jackson Heights. You can definitely see, or you can see that you can predict that there's going to be an enforcement or higher surveilling and policing of street vendors. And also I want to advocate for the lifting the cap. That's something that the Street Vendor Project has been working on towards, and the City of New York Independent Budget Office found that current wait lists for both general vendor license and mobile food vendors is around 20,000 individuals. As you can see, there has been an increase in the amount of caps that there is, while the amount of permits allowed, which is 5,000 currently. However, it's still not catering to the 20,000 people who are on the wait list and are looking to obtain a permit. And yes, thank you.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions for any of the presenters if people have them. Don't be shy. Dean Napoli. Yes.
The source material that I ended up using was I just looked at the literature that I was shown during my time in Brooklyn College, and I went based off of the curriculum. So I did this by looking at what certain professors. Her name is Professor Ana Acosta. She knows more about like high literature. So she was in her class. She kind of demonstrated those examples, and then I just compared it to what I thought would be low literature because I didn't want to. I wanted to create my own definition and see if that coincided with what scholars or professors had said.